George Malkinbeck,
Yes, ma'am.
am I pronouncing that right?
Yes, you are.
Is here this morning to talk to us about this lovely little old church and tell us what he knows. It's a Oakdale treasure.
Well, yes, it's a national landmark. It is the second oldest church in Suffolk County, and we believe it to be the third oldest church on Long Island. Still some research to be done on that. We know this was built, at least one portion of it was built, and needs some architectural looking at this. It was a two-bay church at the time, bays meaning windows, when it was originally built in 1765. And as it stands now, it is restored to 1840, which is when they did some additional additions on it and added some other items in the church. So it's pretty much as it was. It was a family chapel, and in the 1840s it was made a full church, but it is the mother church of all the Episcopal churches in the town of Islip.
So it was, first of all, I have two questions. So which windows were original?
That's something, well, again, you can see some of them have a old long glass. You see the wavy glass. We don't know for sure. I have a word description of it, and it would require actually starting to look behind the walls, which you really don't want to do. No. But eventually we can do some change. In 1965, they also did some renovations, and the congregation here, the very small congregation, actually did much of the restoration of the church with the help of an architectural historian that they had gotten. So they basically did it themselves to get the church back into the shape it's in. In 65, they also did it by putting some shingles on the outside. Of course, these are modern shingles. When it was built, they would have been hand-split shingles, not the silly shakes you see on houses, so forth. They were fairly evenly done, so it's close. And the foundation had brick around it because its original underneath would be a fieldstone foundation. Again.
So was it lifted and a new foundation underneath? Or?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know for sure what was done. We don't have too much information on what was done at that time. It may have just been capped, the brick put on it, because remember they didn't use concrete. They used to use lime, burnt lime shells, which you get from clams or oysters, and then mix it with sand. And if you cap that, you actually damage it because it allows water to flow through. The minute you keep water in, it deteriorates. So basically, the brick foundation is not a foundation. So that's part of the issue of old buildings.
Foundation, deteriorated?
Well, it would deteriorate over the years anyway, and you would have to maintain it. So it was easier to put a more modern brick foundation, which holds the church, which obviously supports the building. And it does it very well, because as you see, this is not, it's
very straight.
Very straight and in good shape. And considering the way they built buildings back then, there's no ridge pole, there's none of the things that we're used to in construction. And it's in very, very good shape.
So do you have any information on where the foundation materials came from? Were those local oysters?
Probably, if that's what it would be local. Everything would have been done local. Going back to the history of the town of Islip, when this was built, this might as well have been the moon. Montauk Highway was, what we know as Montauk Highway, as they would know it as the South Road. The South Road would be only 30 years old at the time. They resisted building a highway through for a number of reasons, which we're still not sure of, but we have some real suspicions of what was going on.
And what would they be?
Anything,
anything
from having to do with the New York piracy epic that was going on in the late 17th century to there wasn't anything here. Agriculture as it was, except in a few small areas of Islip, was extremely difficult. The land wasn't all that great.
So who would have been paying for the building of the road? New York State?
It would have been the ratepayers of the town of Islip. The way they did it, there was a road tax, and you would pay for the length of road that would go through your lands. Now you stop and think for a minute. In the beginning, there was no road because there's 5 people that own all the property. which meant they would have to pay for the road. They are totally crazy. And one of the things when the town of Islip was in theory formed in 1710, they never actually elected anybody, because if they elected people and had a government, they'd have to have meetings and they'd have to charge some taxes. And since there were only 55 voters in all of Islip at the time, remember women did have the vote early. They lost it in 1777, I believe it was. Women lost the vote in New York State. But even so, everybody's sitting there going, I'm taxing me. I'm not stupid. So it isn't until 1720 that they finally got, the colonial governor lost it and said, you're going to be a town, you have to have town officials. So the town officials, and again, we look back at this, I jokingly tell groups when they ask, you know, on the town of Islip, who is the, you know, in the beginning, who were all the officials? It's really simple, just the words, William Nicoll solves the problem, because the Nickolls, all of the Nicoll family was involved in the government. And if you weren't a Nicoll, you were a good friend of the Nickolls or married into the Nicoll family. So if you look at the original officers of the town of Islip, they are all in some way Nicoll. So
and you're not going to... the Nicoll land.
We are on Nicoll land, and this is a Nicoll
And this
chapel.
Was the family.
This was a chapel they built for this area could be farmed. This was halfway decent land around here. So you would have tenant farmers here. So this was built as a chapel for this area of the estate. So it's 55,000 acres. So it's a huge piece of land that he has.
So you're talking about the land out here,
farm. Well, yes, all of this is better land than most of Islip.
Oh.
Most of Islip, you do have some good land in the Bayshore and Islip itself, but it's marshy in some areas. You can do grazing, and that was it. That and lumbering.
That was the crop.
The crop was that, and obviously shellfish, and they could also cut trees, which is what they did. They cut firewood for the city, which until the early 19th century, 1800s, was a big moneymaker, but of course they chopped all the trees down, so that ended that problem.
So now for example, so William Nicoll owned the land and they were cutting trees down. Was that his lumber company? Or?
Oh, yeah. Well, again, when they finally do build the South Road here, which goes by it, the South Road, the governor of the colony ordered that a road be put through Islip. The only road we had in Islip was about 2 miles of what we now know as Route 25, but is actually the King's Highway, and sections of the original King's Highway route still exist, which is in the far north of the area, which would be in what was by then Thompson land, which you know was a Sagacos estate, which later would become the Gardners. Again, marriage. The road was put through, and it basically connected everything on the south portion of Islip that they had already improved. For instance, today we don't go through Connetquot State Park or Connetquot State Park Preserve. However, the road used to went up to the mill, and if you look at it, they were ordered to build the road approximately 1 mile from the bay. Their version of a mile and my version of a mile are two different versions. And what they were doing was they ensured that anything that was important to one of the families was connected.
So it was a publicly funded road at that time when it was built?
Well, yeah, unwillingly publicly funded road, because they basically got ordered to build the road. And they waited till 1735, and you would never guess the names of the people who were the road commissioners. They just happen to be the same people that seem to be running the government all the time. They never actually get around to paving. Some parts aren't paved until the 1920s. The road remains pretty much unpaved, except this section we're in, which is by the Bourne estate. Mr. Bourne got so sick and tired of the dust coming into his estate that he had the road paved. So to go from here to anywhere was a real trial. It isn't until the coming of the railroad in the mid-19th century, the coming of the South Side Railroad of Long Island, that suddenly opens up this entire area to what becomes the first Gold Coast, because people realize that this has been untouched from colonial days. The land is still pretty much undeveloped. The towns are very small, the hamlets are very small, so they can come in and have large hunting estates, which is what these were. And that's why Islip starts growing. You know, and again,
as almost like a tourist or like a sort of like a wealthy man's.
It was a recreational playground because you had the bay, you had shellfish galore, which oysters were big back then.
And are again.
And are again, yes. And you had all sorts of mansions being built, and they could get in and out in their private railroad cars. The family could stay out here in the summer instead of the hot city, and they would come out here. And eventually the Nicoll family starts selling off large parcels of the land. And this eventually will become the last Nicoll parcel, which we're standing on right now.
So three questions actually. So they were basically, the settlement, a lot of it was people servicing the wealthy family?
Right. It depends on the area Islip you're talking about. Islip itself, which William Gibb had the patent. Gibb, I think, wanted the patent for more commercial means. He had other reasons. And he would sell off parcels of his land. The Nicoll land was hung up by the state law of primogeniture, the way it was being passed down, so you had to pass it intact. Right after the Revolution, when they asked all of Long Island to start paying back taxes, since they were occupied all that time, they hadn't paid taxes. New York State said, you owe us so much, and William Nicoll, if you go into the documents, the stories are kind of a little different than the documents show. In the documents, he asked the state for permission to break up the estate. And the state does vote and give him permission. That allows him to sell the eastern portion, which is Sayville and Bayport area, that Edwards and some other people come in and buy that area from him, which he uses to pay the arrears on money owed, or tax money owed, which he wasn't the only one that had to do that, but he was bound by the royal requirement that it be passed as a whole. So that changes it, and as various Nicoll family members get pieces, they're not going to leave the city. We're left with this chapel, which falls eventually into the hands of Louisa Nicoll, who is one of the myriad William Nicoll's daughters.
She's a daughter.
She's a daughter. She gets the eastern half of what's left of the estate. Her brother, William, gets the western half, which we know as East Islip and Hampshire Park and all. She gets this portion, which is called Riverside. She gets the chapel, and she marries William Ludlow. I found many comments in papers that we've located so far that apparently the Ludlows were the lawyers, did a lot of law work for the Nicoll family. So there was a connection between the two families going quite a bit back. She marries William Handy Ludlow. He is involved in the politics of New York City. He eventually will become Speaker of the Assembly of the State of New York. He is buried with his wife out back here, right to the side of the church. They give this place new life. They build a mansion in the back, which is called Riverside, and this is basically Riverside.
Now,
yes,
to where?
It's where the houses are. It's saying actually the last piece of that, and it burned down quite a while ago.
That was the one that wasn't there an explosion with a still?
There were also, after the Nicoll, there's a long history. We could spend hours here with this, but it was just back there, and it was a rather palatial home, and they raised their children here, and they had quite a few children, some of which are buried back there. Two of the most, well, there's three really famous ones, and they would have attended church here. One of which is, the older of them is Nicoll Ludlow. Again,
So he had both names.
Yes, and that's a very typical Long Island thing. You're either going to get the mother's name as a middle name in the early children, or they'll repeat it forever. They will also reuse family names, and that's how we had so many William Nicoll. So Nicoll Ludlow, he will eventually go to Annapolis. He would also wind up in the Navy. He was on the USS Wachusett at the Battle of Bahia, Brazil. A huge diplomatic mess that is still one of the biggest diplomatic incidents the United States ever had. And they bring back a Confederate raider, and he finishes up, and he goes through his whole career in the Navy. His first wife and child die. He is...
How?
I don't know that for sure.
Okay.
I know they both died, and at the time there was all sorts of diseases loose in this country, which we don't even have today.
Right.
He is considered one of the fathers of the modern U.S. Navy, because it was him, people like him, Frank Sprague, and a number of other people that are well known in naval circles, were the ones who were the think tank that said, we got to go from this to a steam and a electrically driven Navy, and all sorts of things happen. So he's one of the people that's pushing this. He will enter the Navy in the Constitution. He will leave the Navy on the USS Massachusetts when she sends her first radio message. So he bridges the sail Navy to the Navy of the modern era. He's a hero of the Battle of San Juan, Puerto Rico, where he served on a ship called the USS Terror, which I have called, and I believe, and he kind of hinted at it, the most aptly named ship in the United States Navy, because it was a sheer terror to ride on it. It was a ship that took closely 25 years to build, so you can only imagine how well thought out it was by the time they finished because of the government.
So, what do you mean it was a terror to ride on? It was
it was a Civil War monitor, which had been, the only thing left of the original ship was the name plate from the back, and they were going to make a steel coastal monitor out of this thing. Well, using the Civil War ideas of a coastal ship and trying to use it as a deep water Navy turned out to be a really big mistake.
In what year is this?
This is 1898.
Oh.
But
they're using steel.
Oh yes, there was steel, armor plate steel. They had to actually, for the first armored ships in the United States, which Ludlow and others argued for, they actually had to import steel from Europe. Second child, and his story will wrap this church in. He marries a second time.
This is Nicoll Ludlow.
This is Nicoll Ludlow. He marries a second time Admiral Dewey's sister-in-law, who I believe is Mary Thomas.
Now, aren't they over in Port Jeff Station, Admiral Dewey?
I don't.
Because there's a whole bunch of streets there. One's Admiral, one's Dewey.
We had that in Sable too. That anything that was developed, you could remember up until through World War I, Admiral Dewey was an extremely important hero. So his name is all over. Plus the fact he visited here. He worshipped right here in this church. He sat in the pews right there in front. So he worshipped with his wife here in this church. Nicoll Ludlow and his second wife had home in Washington, D.C., which is across the street from the Capitol. She would actually go every day and have tea with the president's wife. As when he retires, he's made he's the head of the Naval Retirement Home in Philadelphia, by the Philadelphia Navy Yard. They're there for a while, not bad, at least they're still in the city. And then after a while there, he decides he wants to return to his childhood home of Riverside, which is now his, which is right here, and he missed it. Well, she doesn't miss it. She's never lived here. Besides that, this is still the middle of absolutely nowhere, and in spite of the fact that you had very wealthy people just down the street, they're only here in the summer, and in the winter, again, this might as well be the moon. So she was upset, and various things start happening, and it becomes the biggest divorce of the 19th and early 20th centuries. It's in all the papers. There's some great articles on it. Eventually, he loses in the divorce. He loses the house, and she thinks she gets the church. Only she doesn't know the church was incorporated in 1840 as a separate parcel. So she doesn't get the church. But he has to move out, so he takes all the furniture from the house, and from what I found out, he moved it to what is now the Masonic Hall in Sable. It used to be the Methodist Church, and at that time the Methodists had just built a brand new church building, and they were renting it out, or someone who had bought it. It's very unclear when the title passed. And he lived there for a short time. He would also live at the Union League Club, and not too long after that he passes away. His brother William went to West Point. The interesting part about William Ludlow is, besides being one of the most brilliant engineers in the United States Army, he had probably one of the worst careers in West Point. He demerits overwhelmed just about everybody who's ever attended West Point. And with him,
well, what were the reason for the demerits?
You name it, fighting.
Carousing.
Whether it was carousing or I haven't looked at his complete record. I do know he had a fight because the one fight he had with a cadet was stopped by another now graduated cadet, just graduated, who had not left West Point yet, in spite of the wonderful movie made about this man. He broke the fight up and said, let's have a fair fight. So he broke the two up and they started fighting. And he's sitting there playing, kind of letting it go on. And a senior officer goes by and says, what are you doing? And he goes, Lieutenant Custer, I tried to get you not commissioned and thrown out of the Army before. This time you are out of the Army. This is just as the Civil War dawns. It turns out that George Armstrong Custer would become William Ludlow's closest friend. Ludlow goes as his engineer on the expedition to the Black Hills and the expedition to Yellowstone. William Ludlow writes reports on this, which you can find on the internet, and he is considered the father of the National Park Service because he's the one who says the Army shouldn't be doing this. There should be a civilian park service to run these national parks when they established Yellowstone. It's his survey, along with a couple other Army surveys previous to that, that gets them to make Yellowstone a national park. In any case, William Ludlow then becomes quite famous in the Army. He's on the Ludlow Board, which is what forms the modern Army, by getting rid of leftover Civil War officers, by bringing younger officers up, at the same time establishing a National Guard as a real guard rather than state militias, and talking about an Army Reserve and a Reserve Officers Corps. Those are his gifts. His close friend, he had another close friend whose name was Theodore something or other, Roosevelt, yeah. Theodore Roosevelt and he spent time at Montauk together because they were both at the attack on Santiago de Cuba. When they went there, he was at El Caney, which is when they went up the hill, and Ludlow led them up the hill and fired on the flank. It eased the pressure, so the 9th and 10th Cavalry, along with Roosevelt and his Rough Riders, could get up the hill, and the rest is history. So he had a good friend, the president. He dies tragically of the diseases that he got in the tropics.
This is William.
This is William Ludlow.
Okay.
William is. He also, by the way, is the engineer to design the sewage system, which is still being used in Havana to this day. It works, and helped do away with the yellow fever. He worked with Dr. Gorgas and all those people, and all the various doctors. And his name slipped me up at this point. But anyway, he also designed the waterworks in Philadelphia, which is still there, and a number of other great. He's a very good engineer.
He's an engineer.
And he's a terrific engineer.
This is the same national parks person?
This is the same person.
Wow.
This is the general. And the general is buried here. Then his wife decides, with the shenanigans being pulled by the ex-wife of Nicoll, she has him taken out and he's been moved to Arlington. So he's at Arlington National Cemetery. When you go up to the gate, there's a big hill. If you look at the hill, it looks like there's like in England, a cemetery cross. No, that's her husband's grave. She didn't want anybody to forget him. So he's buried there, as she is to his wife, who was from Compton Station, New Jersey. Edwin Ludlow, who was not buried here, but he was born here in the house in the back, and they all were. Edwin becomes one of the country's leading mining engineers. He does go with his brother William on the expedition with Custer to do surveys. And by the way, one side piece, William was the last person to talk to Custer before Custer left for the Little Bighorn. And supposedly he said, don't be a fool, don't split your force up. Of course, we only have William's side of it at this point, so we don't know. In any case, Edwin becomes very famous, and if you go through the United States, you'll find a lot of Ludlow, towns named Ludlow, parks named Ludlow. They're all because... Yes, and they're all named for him.
Oh.
And he's, from what I understand, I know the ones in Pennsylvania, the ones out west, and a number in the Middle West, because I've been contacted by those people who wanted to know what I knew about Edwin.
So now, William and Nicoll are brothers, and Edwin?
Edwin is one of the brothers.
How many children were in that?
Off the top of my head, I have forgotten.
Okay.
And there's one, Newton Perkins is buried out there. He died young. So there's at least 4, and I think there's a daughter in there too. But I'd have to go back to the family tree because my memory's not that good. In any case, this church now exists in its form when the Ludlows now leave the area.
In what year?
Again, William Ludlow has passed. He's not William. Nicoll Ludlow is buried out there. I think it's got to be in the teens. I don't remember. I have to look at the gravestone.
18 teens?
No, 19.
19 teens.
Right. In 19.
Yeah.
He
right.
dies, after the divorce, and I'm not sure exactly the date.
And were there children from that?
No, the second marriage, there were no children.
No children.
And the church remains. It becomes a serving parish. Ironically, St. John's never grows, but its children grow. St. Anne's in Sado, St. Mark's in Islip. I forgot the name of the Episcopal Church in Brentwood, and also you have Emmanuel Church, which comes later here for Great River.